Stagnics, and welcome to Business Views, the best brains in the business journalism with their take on the week's top stories. Now, on the program, make of some of those comments, suggestions they were quite hawkish in a few places.
There's really the two schools of thought that's almost been prevailing all year. You've got the risk of Europe and US, which Europe looks in all sorts of trouble, regardless of the quasi-rescue package they're hastily arranging for Ireland, and then Spain, then Portugal, and then who knows what else next. But you've got the US, which is rampantly printing money to try and fund a $1 trillion deficit and kickstart an economy that just can't be kickstarted. And you've got the Australian situation where you've got all those factors, but you've also got a property bubble here that the RBA are very wary of.
Do you think it is a property bubble? I mean, that's jury's out on whether or not we are actually seeing an actual property bubble. I know the offshore hedge funds are sort of betting against it, or betting for it, actually.
Certainly, Jeremy Grantham's one that I think you're referring to, who him and Chris Joy got into a bit of a debate about that. But my view certainly is, if you look at the returns on property and as you would any other asset, getting a 2% net yield on an investment isn't a yield that I want, and that's what you're getting when you're buying a residential property. So if you look at Lucy Ellis, one of the RBA major figures there, I think she's in charge of stability. She went from outright denying a bubble to just a few months ago very much changing her tune, not saying as much, but clearly hinting that the RBA are concerned about it. And there's no doubt Glenn Stevens tried to jawbone house prices down, and it hasn't really worked so far. But one thing that does work extremely effectively with house prices is interest rates, because people look at affordability, and they base their affordability decisions on a historically low interest rate. Push interest rates up to 8-9%. Push mortgage rates just up to 8-9%. You've got a very different affordability situation.
Chris, has suggested earliest being August next year. What's your feeling on that sort of, Adam?
I don't like to second guess the RBA because everybody seems to get it wrong, but it's going to come down, as Greg mentioned, it's going to come down to what happens overseas to an extent. There's the stabilising factors of the high Australian dollar that will automatically dampen various parts of the Australian economy. Tourism is one big one. You look at the effect on immigration as well. People are less likely to move to a country when it's just more expensive to live in. So it's certainly a dampening factor there. So to second guess the RBA, I don't think they know what they're doing, let alone for me as an outsider trying to second guess. But I guess the counterbalancing influences of the asset bubbles in Australia versus the potential for European and US double dips it's a question of which way it falls.
Chris, we got some other data. We're still talking about, as Greg mentions, 9% growth and looking for sustainability at 8% growth. So if an interest rate hike here or there isn't going to take off the growth too much.
I'm a bit sceptical of China's data. Forgive me, but
sounds the Prime Minister or the President to be, isn't he?
I think when every GDP figure comes in at about 8.5% year in, year out, quarter in, quarter out, one sort of takes it with a grain of salt. And there's many. It's not the prevailing view, but there's many with the view that China's just been overinflated with debt and credit. Keeping their currency pegged to the US causes a massive stimulus to the economy as well. So they have this huge lending, borrowing boom in China. You got to the point where Chinese people you leave your money in the bank, it's inflated away. So they buy these assets, and the assets, the prices just get bidded up. And as a result, we've got these huge increases in asset prices and huge lending by the local councils in China. And it's just hard to get a grip on exactly whether it's a sustainable economic expansion or it is a very large bubble. And I'm certainly not confident. I know there's a massive population, a massive urbanisation in China, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that it's built on stable foundations, and what the impact that will be on the likes of Australia if it does go awry.
I wouldn't be surprised to see if
was selling the merits of QE2. Adam, what did you make of that? The Reserve Bank.
Well, Bernanke sort of has to say that, doesn't he? He's the guiding force behind the quantitative easing. And as I said last time on the show, there's never been an instance where fiat money and printing money has improved the living standards of people. It's a short-term, almost band-aid solution. It's like the old adage, giving a drunk another drink to try and get over there. US's problems stem from too much debt and a misallocation of capital. And all QE2 does is effectively bail out the banks, who are the institutions who cause the misallocation of capital. So you've noticed a lot of commentators saying, well, so it's the poor old taxpayer, it's the middle class American who's paid for the mistakes of the big banks, and obviously the Federal Reserve itself is effectively a representative of the banks. So not to forget that. So the Federal Reserve is looking after its own, and it's being paid for by taxpayers, and inflation, of course, is the purest form of tax, and that's effectively what increasing the money supply is.
The Fed chairman going on Channel 10, Network 10. Interesting comments from Bruce Gordon at the AGM earlier this week, hinting that he wasn't exactly sure what she'll bring to the board, what value she can bring. Does she bring value to a media company, do you think, Adam?
Well, I guess the daughter of an iron prospector has her own unique take on current affairs, no doubt, but one suspects Gina's got a lot of money, and having a stake in a media company is probably not a bad idea.
To buy influence, is that? I mean, that's one of the report obviously being circulated at the moment.
To kill the mining tax.
But is Channel 10 the pick that you'd look at if you wanted to? It buys you, light entertainment. Suggestions, we might get it over the weekend, potentially on Sunday. What would you like to see come out of it, and do we need one?
What I'd love to see is the government, and it's not going to happen, but the government realising that Australian banks are too big to fail and they should be smaller. And that's certainly not going to happen. That would be an ideal situation. You look at some of the suggestions from Joe Hockey and the Liberals, and some other suggestions from other areas to try and promote bank competition. Seems to miss the point. The problem hasn't been, as Steve Keen's pointed out, the problem isn't necessarily bank competition. Whilst they are an oligopoly, that's not the problem. The problem is banks have lent too much money. So they've got these huge exposures to residential property, to commercial property in Queensland, and the Bank of Queensland showed. And they got the funding very cheaply pre-GFC. They're starting to roll over that funding now. But ultimately, too much money was lent. They had to borrow from overseas to cover their lending. They were lending a lot to try and increase their profits. The problem is, going after a high volume, low margin strategy, especially in the banking sector, exposes to great risks, because there's a lot of money out there pushing up the price of the underlying asset, arguably away from its intrinsic value. So banks, in a sense, have just over-lent. So it's the competition is not the issue. The issue is too much debt. And if you look at mortgage debt to GDP, it's exploded from 23% in the late 90s to 90% now. So Australian homeowners have borrowed a lot more money than they ever used to, which has forced the price of those assets up. So that's a key issue. So worrying about things like ATM fees, $2 ATM fees, sure that they're an inconvenience, but realistically, banks are businesses. They have to make money somehow. It costs 10 grand to put an ATM in. You've got to service the ATM. Banking services aren't free. They can't be free. But what the banks have done wrong is simply lend too much and expose. So
what would you like to see, like more higher liquidity levels or something held by the banks?
Well, ultimately, we look at the Basel requirements of 8.5%, 9%. They're creating inherently insolvent institutions. If everybody wants their money back, there's a run on the bank collapses. The government steps in and bails them out. What's been suggested in the United States is splitting up the retail and the investment bank, which is one way to do it. It still creates some pretty big retail banks, but at least it hides off some of the risk. That's sort of one certain start. But the banks are simply too big. And then there needs to be smaller banks, so if a bank does collapse for whatever reason, it doesn't take down half the economy like it did in Ireland, like it almost did in the US.
What's your take on it, Greg? Share a bit of a lowball offer, do you think, to start with, a starting point for discussions?
I think most companies, when they make a takeover, especially a not preordained one, tend to go in with a bid they expect to knock back initially. But I think with Rio, pardon my cynicism, but Tom Albanese and Rio haven't got the best record when it comes to timing the market. If you've got Alcan and $38 billion, which is about, what, 25 billion, probably too much, then the BHP rejection and the Chinalco deal. So when it comes to corporate moves, Rio hasn't got the best record, Tom Albanese hasn't got the best record, Skinner's gone. But yeah, I'll be very concerned if I was a Rio shareholder and they start opening the chequebook, because their immediate record isn't that great.